What happened in the mountains as a result of industrialization is that mountain people very quickly moved from a relatively independent people who had a large amount of control over their own destiny and lives to a people who were increasingly dependent and whose lives were shaped by external markets and external owners. Appalachia essentially became a dependent society, dependent upon public work and cash income, and dependent upon absentee owners of the land itself. And we've been paying for that dependence ever since.
Tensions from the war continued to simmer in West Virginia during the summer of 1865. Former Confederates campaigned to have 2 northeastern counties rejoin Virginia. Local newspapers refused to use the word West in their mastheads.
Hang me if I say West Virginia. Maps may say what they please, but I say this is Virginia. George Bagby.
Hostilities increased when Governor Arthur Borman's government banned ex-Confederates from voting, teaching, holding office, or practicing law. The spirit of rebellion, said Borman, still reigns in their breasts. Federal troops were sent in to keep the peace. As whites clung to old Virginia, Southern blacks welcomed its demise. Thousands of former slaves arrived in the Shenandoah and Potomac valleys of West Virginia, seeking a new life.
The condition of the Negro families in this vicinity is becoming alarming. Large families of women and children are being driven from their houses daily, and hundreds of them are now roaming over the country, begging for support. J.H. Duvall.
Can you imagine what this great internal migration might have been like for black people? When you have thousands of people simply walking the roads, people who have no food, who have no clothing, who have no money, the territory is hostile, the people around are hostile, and they're trying to find some place to go. I'm not sure that we have a real appreciation for the difficulties of that experience, the horrors of it.
700 blacks crowded into a makeshift tent camp in Harper's Ferry. In the filthy conditions, diseases spread and infant mortality soared.
We have a colored population huddled together with almost nowhere to live and nothing to live on. Nathan Brackett.
Following the war, 29-year-old Nathan Cook Brackett was sent to Harper's Ferry by the Free Will Baptist Home Mission Society of Maine to open schools for ex-slaves. We have the honor of occupying the ground, he said, where John Brown made himself immortal. Yet Brackett found himself unwelcome.
People are exceedingly hostile to any measure that benefits the colored people, especially a school. Threats of violence have been made against anyone who attempts to establish a nigger school.
With help from black residents, Brackett set up a classroom in a federal armory building in Harper's Ferry and found space for 2 more schools in Martinsburg and Charlestown. He requested teachers be sent from Maine.
I am going to Charlestown to open a school there next week. The spirit that hung John Brown still lives, and the people are strongly opposed to schools for the freedmen. I go alone, but I trust the law and the Lord will shield me. Anne Dudley.
When teacher Anne Dudley arrived in Charlestown, white residents sent her death threats. 10 federal soldiers escorted her to school the first day, but Dudley insisted on living by herself in a remote cabin.
I keep a good axe and six-shooter at the head of my bed at night, resolved to sell my life as dearly as possible, if need be.
Sarah Jane Foster, a self-educated Maine schoolteacher, was sent to Martinsburg. A shoemaker's daughter, Foster was a voracious reader who taught so she could afford to buy books. Like many other young Baptist women in the North, Foster had a missionary zeal to help newly freed slaves.
I mean to act so that none can find fault with me about setting up the colored people above their place. I cannot help liking them. Sarah Jane Foster.
In a cramped basement, Foster taught reading and arithmetic to children ages 6 to 18. At night, 50 adults crowded into her classroom, eager to learn as well.
We have been asked to believe that this race are only fit for chattels. A deeper, darker falsehood was never palmed upon the public.
Part of what we have to understand is that it was not just the benevolence of people who came in from somewhere else to do something for these people, that they were interested in trying to help themselves. And I would suspect that this stems from the great effort during slavery to keep blacks from the word, to keep us from being able to read. And so those people who were freed slaves and who came into West Virginia after the Civil War were very interested in trying to get schools started for their children, not only for their children, but for themselves, because many of them, as adults, wanted to learn to read.
Blacks raised $50 a month to keep the school open, but white residents fought to close it. Whites broke school windows, disrupted classes, and taunted Foster on the streets. When she asked male students to escort her home, townspeople were outraged.
Is it any wonder that Southern people treat these Amazons, who with brazen effrontery walk our streets with buck Negroes as gallants, with deserved contempt? Spirit of Jefferson.
It is not the refined and wealthy who are the most bitter, but the lower classes. As one of my pupils remarked, "'Tain't them that used to own servants that's so hard on us, but them that never had none." Sarah Jane Foster.
The bloodhounds are all loose. They have attacked our evening scholars several times lately, and they are threatening to burn our houses. Nathan Brackett.
Under pressure from church officials, Brackett was forced to dismiss Foster. Two years later, the Free Will Baptists opened Storer College in Harper's Ferry for the training of black teachers. Nathan Brackett was named president, and Anne Dudley appointed to the faculty. That year, Sarah Jane Foster contracted yellow fever while teaching at a freedmen's school in South Carolina. She died a few weeks later at the age of 28.
Behind the mists of ruin waved the calico dresses of women who dared. After the hoarse mouthings of the field guns rang the rhythm of the alphabet. W.E.B. Du Bois.
Two things happened in the years after the Civil War. One was that the attitudes of many of the community leaders in West Virginia began to look more favorably toward industrial development than had been the case before the war. The second important thing was that the Industrial Revolution began to occur in the rest of America and created a tremendous need for natural resources. West Virginia was the new frontier after the war. It was the new frontier for industrialization, for the resources that would build industrial America.
In the election of 1870, ex-Confederates, once again allowed to vote, swept Democrats into political power in West Virginia. Democrats failed to change the names of Lincoln and Grant counties to Davis and Lee, but they managed to move the state capital from Wheeling, that iron-hearted city, as one Southern Democrat put it. The effects of government were put aboard a steamboat on the Ohio and taken south to Charleston, a small, nearly inaccessible village in the Kanawha Valley.
West Virginia was now back under the control, ironically, of ex-Confederates who had been included in the new state against their will. And that is one of the great ironies of West Virginia history, is that the people who made it lost it, and lost it within 5 years.
To succeed outgoing Senator Waitman T. Willey, Democrats chose Henry Gassaway Davis, a large, astute businessman who had made a fortune during the war selling supplies to the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. The son of a bankrupt Baltimore developer, Davis started out as a brakeman with the B&O, opened his own general store, and used his profits from the war to form a bank and a land company.
When he was on the railroad as a brakeman, he spent many, many cold hours riding on the top of a coal pile on a coal car. He probably escaped death just by a whisker many, many times over. That was life out on the railroad. Who better to represent a state like West Virginia than someone who has come from the bottom, made his fortunes, knows what West Virginia is all about?
As Davis went to Washington, West Virginia began a campaign to attract industry and new residents to the state. Commissioner of Immigration, Joseph Dis Debar, a French-born artist, designed the state's seal, showing a farmer and a miner with the motto, Montani Semper Liberi, mountaineers are always free. Debar posted advertisements in Europe, promoting West Virginia as the Switzerland of America, a place, he promised, where industry and independence would coexist.
That such a country, so full of the varied treasures of the forest and the mine, should lack inhabitants or the hum of industry or a show of wealth, is an absurdity in the present and an impossibility in the future. Joseph Dis Debar.
Yet when Debar greeted boatloads of Europeans in New York, he discovered that immigration officials described West Virginia as a wasteland, where prices were high and foreigners unwelcome. DeBar did manage to attract a group of Swiss immigrants who founded the community of Helvetia and joined other self-sufficient farmers in the sparsely settled mountains.
The mountaineer is born and nurtured in poverty and seclusion. He has no set pattern to grow up by, with none of the slop shops of civilization at hand to furnish him ready-made clothing, manners, or opinions. David Hunter Strother. The inhabitants of this region are rude and unlettered, but generally thrifty, independent, and devout frequenters of Sunday meetings. Their isolation from the world and each other has nurtured a strong individualism, and there is a great variety of eccentrics among them.
Central to the pre-industrial environment in the mountains was the family. Family was as important as the land. All of the family members tended to work within that farm setting. There was very little separation between men and women in that environment. Children worked alongside parents in the woods and in the garden. And when one wasn't looking to making a big profit off of the land or to getting rich and moving ahead, if one was looking to sustain the family, West Virginia worked very well for these people.
This is the best poor man's county on the globe. You can coon hunt all winter and fish all summer.
The people are generally hospitable. The stranger, if he can eat corn pone, fried pork, and fried chicken, is welcome to their table. In spite of their lack of the ordinary comforts of civilization and their isolation from the world, they all have a comfortable opinion of their surroundings. T.C. Crawford.
The farm was beautiful. Corn would be planted maybe 3 to 5 grains to a hill, one for the woodchuck, one for the crow, one for the weather, and 2 to grow. And when you have chickens, geese, ducks, guineas, and you have horses, you need to know how to take care of all of these animals. My grandmother insisted that girls should know how to do these things in order to be self-sufficient.
The women of Appalachia, they're much stronger than the men. You couldn't kill one of them with a hammer. The old women were very soft-spoken. They appeared to be subservient, but you didn't have to be around very long until you found out who crowed and who laid eggs. These women, they didn't survive. They prevailed.
Farm women tended gardens, preserved food, made the family's clothes, and earned a rare item in the mountains, cash, selling eggs and butter. The only other common way to make money was selling moonshine, a whiskey made from corn. Farmers made barrels of moonshine in backwoods stills and sold it widely, despite a federal law prohibiting the sale of untaxed liquor. Then, Beginning in the 1870s, a temperance movement swept the country. President Rutherford B. Hayes' wife, Lucy, a leader in the Women's Christian Temperance Union, replaced champagne at state dinners with lemonade. She soon became known as Lemonade Lucy. Hayes sent federal tax collectors into the mountains to crack down on moonshine. Known as revenuers, the agents hired informants to spy on their neighbors, disguised themselves as land buyers, and led armed raids on stills. Mountain people, once known for their hospitality, became more suspicious of strangers.
The earliest settlers frequently welcomed strangers into their communities and into their homes. A rider traveling through the mountains could stay almost anywhere and be welcomed into a cabin and be offered the best bed and the best meal and music in the evenings. The suspiciousness of outsiders is a phenomenon that actually began to occur in the late 19th century. Then you begin to find the stories of the suspiciousness and the fear of outsiders, because mountain people have come to see outsiders at that point as someone who's come to take advantage of you and not always to be neighborly toward you.
Here is a great region which is now of little importance to the rest of the country. It was a hard country to fight in. It was an unpromising country to invest capital in. You and I could not be persuaded to live there. And here comes a railroad, and suddenly changes all this. Charles Nordoff, New York Daily Tribune.
In the spring of 1870, work began on the extension of the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad through southern West Virginia. The project was the brainchild of the railroad's president, Collis Potter Huntington. Born into poverty, Huntington had peddled jewelry in the Midwest and butter in New York before making a fortune selling supplies to miners during California's gold rush. He is a hard and cheery old man, wrote a colleague, with no more soul than a shark. Huntington's only weakness seemed to be his growing baldness. He wore black skull caps everywhere to hide his lack of hair. Now Huntington's goal was to build his own transcontinental railroad, and he pursued it ruthlessly.
At a time when people were thinking more in terms of what is in the next county and where can I make my next $10, Huntington was thinking, what is in the next state and the next state beyond that, and where can I make my next 10 million?
The route of the C&O extension crossed 100 miles of rugged mountain terrain. Engineering crews, which included many former Confederate officers, had to be lowered by rope into the steep canyons. Agents recruited thousands of Irish and German laborers from the docks in New York, and thousands of Southern blacks who were attracted by a wage 4 times greater than what they were paid on plantations.
About 5,000 men are now employed on the work of construction along the unfinished part of the line. Wherever we rode, I saw whites and Negroes working together, pushing at the same car, shoveling at the same dirt heap. lifting together at one rock. Charles Nordhoff.
West Virginia, as a state, is probably the most formidable area in the country in which to build railroads. Life was hard out on the C&O. The fellows who built the railroad were nothing more than beasts of burden. Digging the cuts, digging the tunnels, creating the fills, cutting the timber, literally making the cross ties as they came through the trees. Work was more dear than life in many cases. If you worked for the railroad, you did so at your own risk. It was your problem if you got hurt or maimed or died.
Pick and shovel crews burrowed a 6,000-foot tunnel, then the longest in the country, through Big Bend Mountain. The tunnel was dark and crowded. Frequent cave-ins crushed many workers. Others became sick in the foul air and died.
The companies placed greater value oftentimes on the mules than on the workers themselves. It was said that a mule was hard to find. A man could be hired off the street. And so value on human life and human labor was often very low on these construction crews. Disasters occurred almost nightly in many of the tunnels along the lines of the Chesapeake and Ohio. And in some cases, the bodies were literally dumped over the hillside and covered over with rubble. And we'll never know how many workers were killed in the construction of that line.
One black steel driver claimed that he could break rock faster than a new steam-powered drill. He did, creating the legend of John Henry.
John Henry said to his captain, "My man ain't nothing but a man. Before I let your steel drill beat me down, boy, I will die with that hammer in my hand. Yes, I'll die with that hammer in my hand. And I'll die with that hammer in my hand. Yes, I'll die with that hammer."
John Henry was probably a real character. And he very well could have beat that steam drill once or twice. Even John Henry couldn't stop progress. He could stop that one steam drill, maybe, but not the one next behind it, the one behind that.
Near the line's terminus at the Ohio River, Huntington purchased 5,000 acres of farmland, which he sold to the C&O at a handsome profit. Around the railroad's depot and repair yards, a town rose up from the cornfields. Huntington named it after himself.
The first train from Richmond to Huntington. To say that the occupants of the train were welcomed would be a feeble way of expressing the enthusiastic display. A yell burst forth as they came up to the platform, and the passengers were almost dragged out by eager hands. Richmond Whig.
But not everyone was pleased with the railroad. It carries whiskey, complained one newspaper, kills chickens and cows, scares the horses, and throws teamsters out of employment.
The God-fearing Methodists and Presbyterians who had come to get away from the worldly influences, they didn't want the railroad to run on Sunday. The Sunday was Sabbath by God, and they did everything in their power to keep this outside influence, to keep this work of the devil at least away from their churches and families and children on Sundays. The trouble was the railroad needed to run on Sunday. People wanted it to run on Sunday, and sooner rather than later, the railroad started running on Sundays.
Northern capital and northern men are invading this new country. Thus will be induced that intermingling of northern and southern men, which is, in the long run, our best and perhaps only surety for a more perfect union. Jedediah Hotchkiss.
At Quinnamont in the New River Gorge, Joseph Berry, a 30-year-old miner from Pennsylvania, opened the first coal mine along the C&O. 20 more mines began operation within a year. One geologist claimed there was enough coal within 5 miles of the C&O to supply Western markets for 1,000 years. Railroad workers stayed on to work in the mines. Stores, sawmills, whole towns sprang up in the wilderness. Despite opportunities to expand the C&O in West Virginia, Huntington chose to move on. He bought 13 more railroads, created his transcontinental dream, yet seemed discontent and complained constantly about his health. "I would feel better," he told a friend, "if I didn't have to spend most of my life on trains." Huntington's missed opportunity was seized by others. Henry Gassaway Davis's West Virginia Central Railroad became the backbone of his growing empire of timber and coal companies. Davis's closest friend, Johnson N. Camden, a tall, reserved oil developer from Parkersburg, built 2 railroads into the mountains. Davis and Camden bought land and formed businesses together and seized the reins of political power in West Virginia. The 2 industrialists turned political influence into an art form, handing out campaign contributions, private loans to politicians and newspaper editors, and all-important government jobs.
Dear sir, my friend wants an office very, very, very bad. I can't make it any badder than it is. And he wants it instanter. A judgeship, a marshalship, any old thing. William Dawson.
I had not the remotest idea that every man, woman, and child in West Virginia wanted a government position. But I believe they do. Nathan Scott.
On election day, their agents handed out cash and bottles of moonshine. "A little whiskey does more good with our hill people," said one, "than all the speeches we can give." Davis lobbied his fellow delegates on behalf of the B&O, handing out free rail passes to political supporters.
It cannot be a matter of surprise that a feeling of distrust pervades the public mind. When the public servant holds the laws of his country in one hand and a railroad pass in the other. E. Willis Wilson.
In West Virginia, business and politics became intertwined in a way that was not typical of most of the other states. There were people who saw opportunities to make some money. The problem was they needed capital. People were always tempted to use political influence as a means of gaining economic capital. Now, that happened in every town and in every county seat in West Virginia. Local guys who had access to power traded that power for a share, a minority share, in the economic development that was going on.
Charleston is full of land speculators, schemers, stock jobbers, and people so occupied with their own affairs that they are oblivious and dreary, incapable of conversation on other subjects.
David Hunter Strother.
As industry spread into the mountains, a land frenzy swept West Virginia. Agents for outside buyers swarmed into the backcountry, buying land and mineral rights for as low as $1 an acre. One agent traded sewing machines for land. Another bought an entire valley 7 miles long from a farmer for $300 and a horse.
My great-grandfather Larkin made one of the biggest transactions of his life one afternoon. He managed to sell the mineral rights, all the gas and the coal, to about a 10,000-acre tract of land that he had settled early and laid claim to for about $250. And he came home and told his wife what a great deal he had made, that he had managed to get $250 for this coal and this gas that's under the ground. And so they had a celebration, naturally, but little did they know that in 1974, that same tract of mineral land sold for nearly $500 million.
The early settlers in the mountains didn't see land as commodity. They saw land as place. Industrializing America would see the land as something to be bought and sold and resources to be extracted. The traditional community saw the land as something that was always going to be there, something that really reflected family and community and tradition. And so when the first mineral men came through the region, local farmers saw this as an opportunity to acquire cash to pay taxes, or cash to send a son or daughter to one of the mission schools to get an education. It was difficult for them to envision a time when they would be moved from the land, when they would not have access or control to those woodlands.
People thought that they could stay on the land if they sold their mineral rights. They were told that they could often, and that's how much of it was lost. When people lost their land, they really lost their whole life. I mean, all of a sudden, the place where they were used to doing what they wanted, farming where they wanted, hunting where they wanted, suddenly it's like a big no trespassing sign goes up on the whole place. You could literally walk for miles and not set foot on land that wasn't owned by a company. People were totally dislocated. They had no security, and they also had no control over their life. They found themselves treated as strangers in their own place.
In the fall of 1878, near Tug Fork of the Big Sandy River, the border between West Virginia and Kentucky, Anderson Hatfield sued his neighbor, Perry Klein, for cutting timber on his land. The settlement awarded Hatfield all of Klein's property, 5,000 acres of virgin forest. Overnight, Hatfield became one of the largest landowners in the Tug Valley. Tall and formidable, with gray eyes and a flowing black beard, Hatfield was known for his marksmanship and the bear cubs he kept as pets. It was said that he had fought off a mountain lion as a boy, leading his mother to say he was not afraid of the devil himself. The name Devil Anse stuck. Hatfield married a neighbor's daughter, Levice Chafin, on the eve of the Civil War. After the war, they settled on a corner of his father's land near Mate Creek. The couple raised 13 children. Aggressive and ambitious, Hatfield borrowed money from local businessmen to expand his timber business. He hired friends and relatives from both sides of Tug Fork. At the age of 40, Devil Anse Hatfield was the envy of many in the Tug Valley, including Randolph McCoy, a poor, cranky farmer from the Kentucky side of Tug Fork.
Both these individuals tried to make money by selling the timber on their land. And Randolph McCoy failed at this effort, whereas Devil Anse Hatfield was the most successful timber entrepreneur in the Tug Valley. A lot of the resentment and fear of Devil Anse had to do with that very success. He was admired. Many people would like to emulate him. I think Randolph McCoy would have liked to emulate his success. But at the same time, that success was really resented. And they tended to conclude that he had done it in some illegal way, in some immoral way, and this only added to his image as a devil.
10 years later, Hatfield would be famous across the country as the leader of a sensational family feud and labeled an ignorant, bloodthirsty hillbilly. On August 7, 1882, an election day in Kentucky, residents of the Tug Valley gathered at polls in Pike County. Late in the afternoon, Randolph McCoy's son, Tolbert, attacked Ellison Hatfield, Devil Anse's brother, with a knife. Two of McCoy's brothers joined in, stabbing Hatfield 20 times before shooting him in the back.
Tolbert's motivation for this attack seems to have come from his father, who was constantly telling stories about how terrible the Hatfields were, and particularly Devil Anse. The rage that came out was really violent, deadly rage. It was very deep-seated, going back to the different economic paths that these two families had taken.
Friends carried Hatfield back to West Virginia and laid him in a cabin near Maid Creek. Devil Anse captured the three McCoys and told them their fate depended on whether his brother lived. Two days later, Ellison died. At dusk, a band of Hatfields, led by Devil Anse, took the McCoys to the Kentucky side of the river, where they were blindfolded and tied to pawpaw bushes. Then the Hatfields opened fire. The sound of gunshot echoed for miles down the valley.
Normally, they were the friendliest, most generous, hospitable people on earth. But if you pushed them, it was very, very risky business. I mean, they wouldn't let their own push them, much less somebody else. And that's what happened.
Pike County indicted Devil Anse and 19 others for murder, but made no effort to have the Hatfields extradited to Kentucky. Randolph McCoy badgered local officials to arrest Devil Anse, to no avail. McCoy's family urged him to drop the matter. In a way, they said, justice had been served. That year, Frederick Kimball, president of the Norfolk and Western Railroad, decided to expand into West Virginia's southern coal fields. A sophisticated Philadelphia businessman, known for wearing black scarves and jeweled stick pins, Kimball realized the future of the N&W was in hauling coal, not passengers. In Logan County, H.C. Ragland, a real estate developer and newspaper editor, announced that a new era was dawning in the Tug Valley.
Before we can realize it, we will hear the snort of the iron horse and see wealth and prosperity staring us in the face. There is no occasion for any man in the county to be idle who wants to work for good wages. H.C. Ragland, Logan Banner.
As land prices shot upward in advance of the railroad, 4 businessmen who had loaned Devil Anse Hatfield money demanded immediate repayment. One creditor, James Nybert, an agent for a Cincinnati lumber firm, called in a debt 9 years old. To raise cash, Hatfield mortgaged his property to Nybert's partner, H.C. Ragland, who would get the land if Hatfield defaulted.
Devil Anse represents West Virginians caught in economic and political changes that were of incredible magnitude at that time. Devil Anse and his friends were not trying to stop what we would call civilization or progress. They, in many ways, wanted it to come and welcomed it, but they wanted to have what we would say, have a piece of it. They wanted to be part of it. They wanted to prosper with it. And the dilemma really came when it became clear that the managers of those corporate forces did not want local people to share in it. And that's really what the argument came down to ultimately, was who was going to benefit from economic development, which really should have been a good thing for everyone.
In 1887, Perry Klein moved to settle his own score with Hatfield. After losing his land, Klein had moved to Kentucky, where he had become a prosperous lawyer and sheriff of Pike County. After Klein campaigned for him, Kentucky Governor Simon Bolivar Buckner promised he would bring the Hatfields to justice.
If we fail to repress this lawlessness or bring the offenders to justice, we have no right to complain of the false estimation in which we are held by the people of other states. Simon Buckner.
Worried that Kentucky's reputation for violence was hurting business, Buckner offered a reward for the capture of Devil Anse and requested that West Virginia extradite those charged with murdering the McCoy brothers. West Virginia Governor E. Willis Wilson refused Buckner's request. Wilson claimed that Kentucky was using the Hatfields as scapegoats. To show his appreciation, Devil Anse named his 12th child E. Willis Wilson Hatfield.
Every man in Logan County who knows me will tell you I'm a peaceful, law-abiding man, and no man will say I ever told a falsehood. In this contest, I've only defended myself, as any man would do under similar circumstances. Anderson Hatfield.
Anse Hatfield is universally regarded in this community in a favorable light. He possesses the extraordinary virtue of paying his debts, and a man who is financially honest in this country ranks so high that the mere fact of his having been guilty of a little peccadillo of murdering is not charged up against him in a general estimate of his character. New York World.
Tired of waiting for official results, Perry Klein hired 25-year-old Frank Phillips to to arrest the Hatfields. Fearless and explosive, Phillips was known as Bad Frank for his fighting, womanizing, and public drunkenness. In December 1887, Phillips led a posse of 20 armed men into West Virginia, taking one prisoner and threatening more arrests. Devil Ance's son, Cap, claimed Randolph McCoy was behind the raid and proposed kidnapping him.
Cap Hatfield is simply a bad young man. His right eye is a watery blue. His other has been disfigured by an explosion. He stares off into vacancy, like a person disposed of melancholia. T.C. Crawford.
7 friends and family members agreed to join Cap. We wished, said one, to be able to sleep beside better bedfellows than Winchester rifles. At dawn on New Year's Day, 1888, Cap Hatfield and his men crossed the river into Kentucky and surrounded Randolph McCoy's log house. Cap called out for McCoy to surrender. Suddenly, Chauncey Hatfield began shooting, and 2 others set the house on fire. As they fled the flames, 2 of Randolph's children were shot and killed. Their mother, Sally McCoy, ran to them, but Chauncey knocked her unconscious with his rifle. Randolph and 2 other daughters escaped through a window and hid safely in the pig pen. The Hatfields withdrew, dejected over the botched raid. "We have made a bad job of it," remarked Ellison Mounts, who was said to be Ellison Hatfield's illegitimate son. "There will be trouble over this."
What's significant in one way about this is that Devil Anse did not go along. Now, some people say he didn't go just because he was ill. That is very difficult to believe, that if Devil Anse had decided he wanted to do this, he would have been there. The attack itself was horrendous. It was the event that brought the feud to the attention of a national public.
The latest vendetta in the backwoods shows the purely savage character of the population. It is evident that a strong course of common schools, churches, soap and water, and other civilizing influences is required before these simple children of nature will forbear to kill a man whenever they take a dislike to him. New York Times.
This is, I think, the first time that the Appalachians have been presented as being violent for no reason. They're somehow genetically or culturally just different. And that's the image that has been perpetuated to this day. It is a turning point of people's image of Appalachia.
The image of the mountaineer as the sturdy frontiersman living on the land, independent, freedom-loving, switched to this image of the ignorant mountaineer living in squalid poverty at the same time that the coal industry was coming in to take over the land. And I believe that that switch happened because it was convenient for it to happen, because it helped justify this wholesale theft from the people of West Virginia.
Frank Phillips struck back. leading raids into West Virginia and seizing 11 more prisoners. Phillips shot 2 of them in the head.
We have been tried, convicted, and sentenced by the press before they knew the fact of our case. You will find us all different people from the general ideas entertained of us. Valentine Hatfield.
Eight Hatfields were tried for murdering the McCoy brothers, found guilty, and given prison terms. Ellison Mounts was convicted of killing Randolph McCoy's daughter and sentenced to death. Mounts boasted that Cap would free him at the last minute. Governor Buckner set the hanging for February 18, 1890. "5,000 spectators gathered in Pikeville, despite a Kentucky law forbidding public executions. As a black hood was pulled over his head, Mounts cried out, "They made me do it. The Hatfields made me do it." Then he fell to his death. Later that year, construction began on the Norfolk and Western Railroad through the Tug Valley. Devil Anse Hatfield missed out on the economic boom that followed the arrival of the railroad. Hatfield moved his family out of the Tug Valley to a high mountain ridge. Yet he continued to place lookouts in the windows of his home to guard against an attack.
And he would give them a rifle, and they'd hold this rifle on their lap and would look out that window, and he would tell them, "Now, don't take your eye off from that window. You look out that window and watch, because your dad's going to take a nap, and I don't want to take a chance." And Aunt Vicey would get mad, and she would bawl him out and say, "Anderson," she called him Anderson, "Anderson, why don't you go on in there and go to bed and sleep? Those McCoys are not coming all the way over here in Logan County to Island Creek. Why don't you go on in there?" He said, "Oh, Lord, honey, no." Said, "I can't do that." Said, "I love you too much."
We have undergone a fearful loss of noble lives. The war spirit in me has abated, and I do not wish to keep the old feud alive. I suppose that everybody, like myself, is tired of the names of Hatfield and McCoy. Cap Hatfield.
After learning to read and write from his wife, Cap Hatfield attended law school, served as a deputy sheriff, then established a law practice with 3 of his children. At the age of 73, Devil Anse experienced a religious conversion and was baptized by a Baptist preacher. 10 years later, he died at his home. Hatfield's obituary was printed in the New York Times. 500 people attended his funeral. Over his grave, Hatfield's family erected a life-size marble statue carved in Italy.
What the public grasped upon was the family aspect of this, which is really a small part of the feud. A family that was so loyal to each other and so dedicated to each other that they would go to these what seemed shocking and radical extremes to defend it. So they both hated Devil Anse and were repelled by him for his violence, but they were admiring and saying that they were too passionate about their family affairs for modern civilization.
Ambitious men in democracies care much more for success than for fame. What they most ask of men is obedience. What they most covet is empire. Alexis de Tocqueville.
By 1890, West Virginia was booming with industry. Prospectors struck oil along the Ohio River, turning the Sistersville oil field into the most productive of its time. In Wheeling, over half of the city's 30,000 residents worked in a factory or mill producing steel, textiles, tobacco, and pottery.
The Industrial Revolution is a real revolution for men in that they go from a situation where they had been primarily agricultural workers to a new identity as an industrial worker. There's no parallel explosion, no parallel revolution for women in the state because the jobs that do open up, for the most part, exclude women. Even for those women for whom the Industrial Revolution has some meaning, it does not redefine them. They would take the kind of work they had done in the home and just recreate it in another environment and recreate it for wages.
As the timber resources of other regions diminished, attention turned to the southern Appalachian Mountains. In West Virginia, 10 million acres of virgin forest covered 2/3 of the state. Then came the loggers. Logging railroads snaked up into the forest from the main lines. Once again, immigrants laid much of the track, including Italians who were known only by the identification tags worn around their necks. Logging camps were hacked out of the woods. A single 2-story building served as a kitchen, dining room, and bunkhouse for 100 men. A crew of 6 wood hicks, as the lumberjacks were known, could cut 200 trees in a day. Whole mountainsides were shaved clean and the logs taken to a band sawmill, where 17 acres of forest were processed every day. Wood Hicks hit the nearest town on Saturday night. Those atop Cheat Mountain descended on Cass, a clean, orderly village on Greenbrier River. Directly across the river from downtown was Brooklyn, a raucous collection of saloons and cheap hotels reachable only by a swinging bridge. Everyone called it the Brooklyn Bridge. Despite a local prohibition on the sale of alcohol, Wood Hicks found plenty of beer and bootleg whiskey in Brooklyn's saloons. Drunken brawls spilled out of doorways onto what was known as Dirty Street. Schoolteacher Emma Berner led repeated efforts to clean up Brooklyn. She disguised herself as a man, bought booze in saloons, then returned with police deputies to raid the place. One raid seized 90 cases of whiskey. The bootlegger turned out to be the town's deputy sheriff. Outside corporations controlled the timber industry in West Virginia. Non-residents owned 3/4 of the timberland in Wyoming County, 2/3 in Logan, and over half in Mingo County.
The state is rapidly passing under the control of large foreign and non-resident landowners. In a few years, we will occupy the same position of vassalage to the north and east that Ireland does to England. William McCorkle.
Because of absentee ownership of the state's resources, the dollars that could have built better schools and better roads and better health services in the early part of the century flowed out of the region, and we got what we call growth without development. We got a short period of immense growth and expansion and boom period and jobs, but we didn't get the development of those aspects that will sustain a community over time and provide a quality of life.
West Virginia has not, up to the present time, done much with its scenery, except mar it, mutilate it, and burn it up. West Virginia Conservation Commission.
By 1900, aggressive logging had removed half of West Virginia's forest. 20 years later, it was all gone. Fires swept across the barren landscape, leaving more scars. For the first time, West Virginia came to be seen as a place of ugliness. A monotonous panorama of destruction, as one writer put it.
We think coal and live coal. If you take our coal from us, we shall go back to the days of the bobcat and the wilderness. Coal is our existence.
The nation needed coal. Locomotives, factories, ships, generators, home furnaces, all burn coal. Before 1900, most coal came from northern fields stretching from Pennsylvania to Illinois. The opening of the massive coal fields of West Virginia changed everything.
The state is a huge layer cake. The slices are mountains, the layers are rocks, and the filling is coal. Flat, thick, regular, and rich. James M. Cain.
The first entrepreneurs into the coal fields were former miners. John Cooper began mining in Wales at the age of 6, emigrated to Pennsylvania, then headed south to West Virginia. Cooper borrowed $20,000 and opened his own mine in Mercer County.
When John Cooper moved on the Bluestone River, there were no roads, there were no schools, there was nothing, but he owned a lease to 1,000 acres of some of the richest coal-bearing land in America. He had to bring in labor, he had to negotiate sales contracts, he had to deal with the railroad, he had to physically construct a sawmill to build a house to live in. He literally, with his hands, had to build a coal mining operation.
Cooper was joined by aspiring young miners from the north and the sons of ruined southern planters who came in search of lost wealth and prestige.
I came here determined to get enough money so that I could tell any man to go to hell. Several million would do. I didn't want 100 million. William Tams.
Independent coal operators hired a few dozen local farmers and worked shoulder to shoulder with them, breaking up the scene. Near the mine site, operators and miners lived together in crude camps.
There was a little dirt road that ran along the creek, and sometimes where there wasn't room for the creek and the road and the railroad track, the road was the creek, and the wagons with horses pulling them would drive up the creek in the water. And where it widens out in the bottomland, there would be a line or two of miners' cabins, usually a tipple or two, a company store with the big steps out front, the mining offices, sometimes a church, and then it would narrow out again and go on up to the next camp.
Early coal operators were completely independent. The way that a coal operator opened up a mine in southern West Virginia was he obtained a lease from a land company, which was wholly owned by the railroad. In a sense, the early coal operators and the coal miners were together in this little town, and allied against them were massively powerful industrial forces, a railroad, landholding company, and lease company.
In less than 6 months, an operator could turn a profit selling his coal to the railroad. As their wealth grew, many operators moved their families away from the dirty coal camps. Several dozen operators formed their own bank and built the town of Bramall around it. With its well-appointed houses, school, and bustling main street, Bramall was a world away from the coal camps. Yet it was also remote from urban America. The family of Phoebe Goodwin, a coal operator's wife, worried that she had left Pennsylvania for the wilderness. They insisted she return home for the birth of her children. Other wives and daughters who went east were embarrassed to find their dress years behind the fashion. As coal grew into a big business, independent operators were forced to merge or sell out to large corporations. Philip Goodwill of Bramall sold the coal company his father had started. His own 3 sons had trouble finding steady work and took to drinking. Their mother, Phoebe, feared no one would hire such society boys. The Goodwill family fortune, like that of many other pioneer operators, dwindled away. The first miners in the coal fields were local farmers. They mined only part of the year, returning home in spring and fall to manage their crops. They make good woodsmen and guides, said one operator, but their shiftless methods of living have not accustomed them to sustained labor.
Many of our best men are out today for no apparent reason other than they do not want to work. The majority are still drunk. I cannot get them to work as long as they have a cent or a bite to eat. Bert Wright.
Operators began looking for other workers. They recruited thousands of Hungarian, Russian, German, Greek, and Polish immigrants, many with mining experience.
Many African-American men were enticed to come by the labor recruiters to work in the southern West Virginia mines, even though they had a little experience in mining before. The 1890s and the turn of the 20th century were the height of racism in the South, the height of Jim Crow. So West Virginia offered real opportunities to improve one's life, to provide a home and a foundation for the future.
By 1900, there were 20,000 coal miners in West Virginia. 1/3 were foreign-born. 1 in 5 was black. The majority were native whites, including many mountaineers who had left the farm for good.
The coming of the coal camps to the mountains revolutionized Appalachian communities. Coal camps were closely knit, tightly controlled, artificial communities that were created in an area where urban areas and urban communities simply didn't exist. 80% of the coal miners in southern West Virginia lived in company-owned communities.
As mining boomed, coal camps grew into company-owned towns. Company doctors dispensed medicine. Company preachers intoned sermons and buried the dead in company cemeteries. Company guards policed the streets. On Sunday afternoons, company-sponsored baseball teams competed against each other. All of it under the control of the coal operator.
They had running water in their house. We carried our water. They had commodes and we had outdoor toilets. But they didn't try to rub nothing like that in. They were friendly if they was around you, but you didn't go to none of their parties, and they didn't come to none of yours.
We're not running a Christian camp meeting or a Sunday school. The sole purpose of the organization is to make money. Matters of conduct that tend to produce a contradictory result should be promptly squelched with a heavy hand. Justice Collins.
To use the expression of the Middle Ages, I was the high justice, the middle, and the low. William Tams.
Tams had the reputation of being one of the most paternalistic of the coal operators in southern West Virginia. He hired local policemen to walk up and down the streets of Tams, his community, in the evenings to assure that everything was quiet and peaceful. If a husband and wife would be arguing and yelling at each other, that the constable would bring the couple to Tams and he would settle the dispute. That characterized his control over his community.
Miners were paid in scrip, a paper currency issued by the company, despite a law forbidding the practice. Scrip was good only at the company store, which sold food, clothing, and household goods, often at excessively high prices. Unable to pay in full, many miners went in debt to the company store, which then became a company bank.
In the Pocahontas coal field, there were some 120 small company towns. They averaged about 500 people. The railroad was the only way in, the only way out. The isolation created a fierce sense of community. The whole town centered around one thing, mining coal. There was a purpose and a central mission to the town that communities don't have nowadays.
There's not a division between people who mine coal for a living and those who don't. Everyone does. Everyone shops at the same store. Everyone goes to the same school. I went to a 2-room school, and the coal mine was not that far from the community. And so our fathers would often come to the school on the way to work and have lunch with us. These big men sitting in our little tiny chairs at the tables where we had lunch.
Some company towns were clean and well maintained, with sturdy houses, paved streets, bowling alleys, and a theater. But many coal towns were cheerless and filthy.
As you look out of the train window, riding through the heart of the Logan County coal field, you see on either side camp after camp, in which the houses are little more than shacks. Camps look like the temporary quarters of some construction gang at work. Yet they are permanent towns. Winthrop Lane.
Coal dust spread like a thick black paste over everything.
One of the greatest enemies women who lived in coal camps had was dirt. That heavy, heavy black of coal dust. And so one of the memories I have of my mother, she was always cleaning. She couldn't keep the outside of the house clean. So the inside of the house, what she could control, had to be spotless. And after all of her children went to bed at night, she would stay up and polish those floors and polish that woodwork every night while she waited for my dad to come home from work.
In their backyards, women tended chickens, cows, and pigs. Few families had indoor plumbing. Creeks provided drinking water and sewage disposal.
In our town, we have many good things, good churches and schools. But there is another thing of much more importance that the coal operators have intentionally overlooked: our freedom. Joe Brutiniti.
Most of the members of the county court were coal operators, and they had a system of constables where these constables on election day would go about and hand out the list of who you were supposed to vote for. And when the constable handed it out, you were the coal miner and others were expected to go vote for that list.
You didn't even own your own soul in those damnable places, remembered one miner. Nothing symbolized the lack of freedom in company towns more than the company-owned houses rented by miners.
They didn't paint the houses very often. I can only recall them where I lived being painted one time in a lot of years that I lived there. But a lot of people would get paint and paint them themselves, you know. Sometimes the company give you a little bit of paint to do it, but they didn't do that very often, I can tell you that.
One of my earliest memories is of living in this white coal camp house that had turned gray because it was so dingy with the coal dust. And then the company came and repainted the houses, and they painted them all this real icky yellow color that nobody liked. And I was sort of asking, you know, why can't we have, you know, why can't we have a greenhouse, you know? And my mom saying, well, the company decided this is what they were going to paint the house. It's their house. And I remember I would go to school and I would read about American history and freedom and how people had come to this country in search of their own land, and realize that where I lived, we didn't own the land that our house sat on, and we didn't own our house. That somehow America was someplace else. It didn't apply to us.
Underground was another world, dark, wet, and cramped. Miners were paid by the ton, not by the hour. There was an independence rare in factory work above ground, yet many miners charged that operators cheated them by underweighing their day's work. West Virginia miners were supposed to be at least 14 years old, yet few were required to prove their age. Boys as young as 9 joined their fathers underground. There were no restrictions on where or how many hours children could work.
I started work with my father as a hand loader. If he got 2 cars, I'd get the 3rd one. Oh my gosh, it was rough. It was hard. Every shovel full of coal you picked up was heavy and hard. There was nothing easy about it.
Filled with gases and thick dust, prone to explosions and roof collapses, a coal mine was the most dangerous workplace in America.
Hard-working miners, their dangers are great, and many while working have met their sad fate. They're doing their duty as all miners do, shut out from the daylight and dotting ones too.
Coal mining was an extremely dangerous occupation, extremely dangerous. From 1897 to 1928, 10,000 men died in West Virginia coal mines. 10,000. In West Virginia. I'm not talking about the country. I'm talking about West Virginia. That's a stunning fact to me.
2 men injured by a powder explosion died last night. We buried one who has no relatives. The other we sent to Virginia to avoid keeping his widow and children. The accident will cost us $20. If 12 can be collected from the county for coffins. Bert Wright.
Mine safety regulations were weak and poorly enforced. Inspectors were often political appointees with no experience in the mines. There is not an inspector in this state, claimed one miner, who is not holding his job through the influence of an operator. When the state legislature passed a bill requiring higher standards for mine inspectors, Governor William A. McCorkle vetoed it.
The greatness of West Virginia is founded upon our coal. Can the legislature afford to do anything that would hinder the progress of this great industry? William McCorkle.
My father was killed in a mine accident. He got the sleep covered him up and killed him. Him and another young boy about my age was killed at the same time. It was bad. If you didn't watch yourself, you'd be a fatality.
At 2:30 in the afternoon of December 6, 1907, a massive explosion ripped through the Fairmont Coal Company mine at Monongah in northern West Virginia. Flames and billowing smoke erupted from the ground. The blast blew buildings clear across the West Fork River. In parts of town above the mine, gaping cracks opened in the streets. Townspeople rushed down the hillside in panic. Family members gathered near the collapsed mine opening, praying for survivors. One woman pulled out all her hair. Others screamed and clawed their faces till they bled. As bodies were pulled from the rubble, Monongah's only bank was converted into a morgue. Overwhelmed by the number of Catholic victims, priests couldn't handle all the funeral services and sent for help. The official death toll was 361. That didn't include dozens of boys who worked off company record books. It was the worst mine disaster America had ever seen. 1,000 children lost a father or a brother. 250 women were left as widows. Fairmont Coal offered families $150 compensation. Company lawyer A. Brooks Fleming, a former governor, thought the offer was generous. "I think the money would be quite a Christmas present," he said. One widow went to the mine opening every day, returning home with a few lumps of coal. She picked through it carefully, hoping to find some remains of her husband, whose body was never found. When she died, her sons donated the pile of coal to a local church. In the spring of 1912, coal miners from Paint Creek, 10 miles south of Charleston, walked off the job when operators refused to renew their union contract. In nearby Cabin Creek, non-union miners joined the strike. "We have to get out of the oppression of the coal barons," said one. At issue was the union itself. Since its founding in 1890, the United Mine Workers of America had made little progress in southern West Virginia. Union organizers were harassed and beaten by company guards. In some counties, it was illegal to even discuss a strike.
The coal operators' perspective was that they were involved in a war. They convinced themselves that they were in a struggle for survival. The union threat, as they saw it, was that it was going to raise their cost of operation. They felt they would have to pay higher wages to union workers. An element that they couldn't control would come into the picture. They wanted order, and this was part of their way of seeing that there was order in their operation. And it became almost a patriotic sort of thing, and they convinced other people who were not coal operators, other people in the middle class, that this was essential, that they could not allow the United Mine Workers to operate in West Virginia.
In May, Paint Creek operators hired 300 guards from the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency of Bluefield. Their job was to protect company property and evict striking miners from company houses.
The evictions were just mean, vicious things, and the detectives did it in a mean, vindictive kind of way. One woman, Maud Fish, was at breakfast when they came, and she said, "Give me time to finish my breakfast," and they said, "You've had time." And they carried out her breakfast and set it on the road along with everything else she owned. There was a funeral early in the afternoon, and a very highly respected old lady there on Paint Creek had died. When they got out of the church, they went home and found their furniture had been set out on the road, and they no longer had a home. Those were the kinds of things that just infuriated the miners and drove them to violence.
I doubt whether it will result in good to evict the tenants. If I was a tenant and my goods should be taken out and left in the street, I would become more desperate than I otherwise would be, and more likely to commit unlawful acts. Henry Gassaway Davis.
To house the evicted miners, the UMWA erected a tent colony at Holly Grove. 35,000 men, women, and children moved in. The expense of operating the camp quickly drained the union's resources. When union support wavered, local miners took over control of the strike.
We don't propose to get out of the way when a lot of capitalists come down and tell us to get off the earth. They played that game on the American Indian. They gave him the end of a log to sit on and then pushed him off. We don't propose to be pushed off. Frank Keeney.
Soft-spoken, yet explosively temperamental, Frank Keeney had been fired, evicted from his house, witnessed beatings by mine guards, and seen hell turned loose, he said. Now there was no turning back, he told miners, and began handing out rifles.
Keeney is a true leader of his people. He has the hypnotic influence of power. Even the passing of a Union car brings a cry of "Frank Keeney" from the streets and the camps. Edmund Wilson.
Keeney was assisted by Fred Mooney, a fellow Cabin Creek native who had started mining at the age of 13. For the past 3 years, Mooney had bounced from one coal camp to another, seeking a better life for his family. He arrived in Cabin Creek just months before the strike.
After 3 years of hard work and self-denial, I looked at my 2 children dressed in common gingham. Then I looked at my wife, attired in a dress made of cheap calico from the company store. I said to her, "Lillian, we don't seem to be getting anywhere. It's just work, work, and nothing to show for it." Fred Mooney.
As miners and guards dug in, Keeney sent for Mary Harris Jones, a colorful 80-year-old Irish labor organizer known as Mother Jones.
Mother Jones. Her very name expresses the spirit of revolution. Her striking personality embodies all its principles. Eugene Debs.
After losing her husband and 4 children to a fever epidemic in Memphis, Mary Harris had opened a dressmaker's shop in Chicago, where she lost everything in the Great Fire of 1871. She joined the United Mine Workers as an organizer. Normally quiet and shy, in public she became profane and dramatic. "I am not a humanitarian," she declared. "I'm a hellraiser."
If she be, in truth, a Doctress Jekyll, Mrs. Hyde, she is wonderful in her black silk, her carefully dressed silvery hair, her silk stockings, and neat pumps. New York Times.
She would go actually into the mines and down into the tunnels and meet miners down there at the face digging coal. At one West Virginia mine, she sat on a rock near the pit mouth, and she said, "Come, my children." And the miners slowly gathered around her as she would say, "Do you know the kind of life you're leading, my children?" And then she began to speak, and they just were mesmerized. And finally one came forward and said, "Don't tell us that there's Mother Jones. That's Jesus Christ come back again in the form of an old woman." Something like that.
Jones arrived at Cabin Creek on a warm Sunday morning in June. she was greeted by a line of machine guns manned by mine guards. "If you fire one shot here today," she warned them, "we will not leave any of your gang alive."
Mother Jones had an expression: there's no peace in West Virginia because there's no justice in West Virginia. She was a fearless lady. The people who manned the machine guns and didn't hesitate to shoot down male strikers would never kill Mother Jones, and she knew they wouldn't.
When the time comes in the history of this struggle that a mine owner or Baldwin guards will intimidate me, I want to die in that hour. Mother Jones.
In the Holly Grove tent colony, Mother Jones found conditions unlike any she had seen. Women and children huddled inside ragged tents, caught in a crossfire between guards and miners. In the mud and filth, many were sick and hungry. All were terrified.
Medieval West Virginia, with its tent colonies on the bleak hills, with its grim men and women. When I get to the other side, I shall tell God Almighty about West Virginia.
In August, Mother Jones led 3,000 marchers to the state capitol in Charleston, where she read a declaration of war to Governor William Glasscock and told miners not to give up hope.
She made about a half a dozen major speeches urging her boys to resist, to stand firm. At times, there's no question, she urged them to fight with guns. She even loaned them money so that they could buy guns.
Inspirited miners shot up trains carrying strikebreakers and attacked the camps of Baldwin Felt's guards. In one raid, a dozen guards were killed as they cooked breakfast. Miners cut up the bloody coat of one victim and wore pieces as souvenirs. On the night of February 7th, 1913, a train crept slowly towards Holly Grove. In the freezing darkness, a machine gun suddenly opened fire on the tent colony, killing one miner. The attack was organized by a coal operator with help from the county sheriff. A few days later, 12 miners and 4 guards were killed in a shootout. Governor Glasscock declared martial law and sent 1,200 state militiamen to Paint Creek. Soldiers confiscated weapons and arrested 300 miners who were given military trials and sent to jail.
The coal operators and the government of West Virginia have been one and the same. King Coal and his barons have ruled in and by means of the institutions of society. Samuel Gompers.
Troops seized Mother Jones on the street in Charleston and put her under house arrest. A sympathetic guard smuggled out her messages, including several that made their way to Washington, and prompted a congressional investigation of the strike. "I can raise just as much hell in jail as anywhere," she said later. Conditions worsened in the tent colony. Epidemics of smallpox, measles, and diphtheria spread. Food became scarce, and a mood of bitterness set in. On March 5th, 1913, his first day on the job, newly elected Governor Henry D. Hatfield slipped out of Charleston at dawn towards Holly Grove. Devil Lance's nephew, Hatfield had left the Tug Valley to earn a medical degree, then returned home to work as a doctor for the N&W Railroad. He entered politics and at the age of 37 was elected governor. Carrying only his black doctor's bag, Hatfield spent 2 days in Holly Grove treating the sick, then promised to resolve the Paint Creek strike, now one of the nation's most violent.
Governor Hatfield saw himself as a champion of the common person. He came back to Charleston and the coal operators had heard what he was doing and were furious. Hatfield became so angered at the operators' insistence that he had done something terrible that his temper got the better of him and he punched out one of the coal operators, which I always thought would have been a great scene to see. And just apparently flattened him right there in the governor's office. But he also squandered his chances to be a hero for the miners. Like many people in political office, he began to think that maybe he could compromise and do something to please both sides. And in trying to please both sides, he really ended up pleasing neither side.
A month later, Hatfield announced a compromise agreement, giving miners a 9-hour workday, a system of checkweighman to guard against company cheating, and an unspecified right to organize, though operators were not required to recognize the union. Rank-and-file miners rejected Hatfield's agreement, saying it offered nothing new and had no means of enforcement. Hatfield gave them an ultimatum: accept the terms or face more troops and prison sentences. Reluctantly, the miners returned to work. Hatfield withdrew the militia, suspended the judgments of the military courts, and released Mother Jones after 85 days in captivity. Then Hatfield boarded a train for Wheeling to attend the state's 50th birthday celebration. Presiding over the festivities was Henry Gassaway Davis, just 5 months shy of his 90th birthday.
We have spent 50 years demonstrating to the world that we possess nearly all the requisites of commercial greatness. Let us begin the next half-century with a determination to use the material we have to build our own house instead of our neighbors across the way. Henry Gassaway Davis.
In its first half-century of statehood, West Virginia had seen 2 bitter civil wars. One over union, the other over unionization. Now, as events in Wheeling got underway, the state was once again at peace. For the time being.